You really have to play fearlessly, which doesn't mean you play recklessly or stupid or anything like that. But when an athlete plays fearlessly, those are growth opportunities to become better and better. Whenever an athlete performs in fear and then they're not successful, well, then the residual emotion, the casualty emotion is guilt and shame and embarrassment and even greater fear. So you want an athlete that's fearless, but not in fear of making a mistake.
Welcome to the Built for Winning podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Friday. Built for Winning is a framework centered on physical, mental, social, and spiritual growth, helping individuals and teams close the gap between where they are and where they want to be. Today's guest is Dr. Peter Ganshirt, a licensed clinical psychologist who has been serving student athletes at the University of Cincinnati since 2008. With more than 35 years of experience, one of his primary areas of expertise is sports performance and helping athletes achieve optimal mental states. Our paths first crossed through the Cincinnati Bengals, where Dr. Ganshirt serves as the team's sports psychologist. Over the years, we've had many conversations about the psychological principles behind reaching the zone of optimal performance, and I'm excited to continue that conversation today. Dr. Ganshirt, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Let's go, baby. We're in the zone. Let's go.
Hey, I have a few rapid fire quick questions just to start things off. What's one belief you have that most people disagree with?
That mental skills training is easily attained. It takes a lot of work, people think it comes natural, but it's definitely a mental rep, a mental training process.
What's one thing most people misunderstand about mental toughness?
Yeah, I think there's this debate about whether it's part of our DNA or it comes natural. When we evaluate athletes for the draft, for example, we're always trying to find that it factor, but it's not part of DNA. It's definitely a learned trait. You have to train yourself to get mentally focused and into that zone. It does not come naturally. So it takes a lot of work to get to that state of performance.
Is anxiety a good or bad thing?
Yes, it's a tricky question, but yes, it's both good and bad. And we'll probably talk more about it later on this podcast. But anxiety is one of those emotions that can be a real asset to you, or it can be your worst enemy. But it's both good and bad.
I'm assuming there's an optimal zone of anxiety to get in as well.
There is. And the most common misconception is that athletes should have some anxiety when they go out to perform. That's just the natural state of anticipatory competition. But they often confuse the emotion. We're going to talk about feelings throughout this podcast. They often misconstrue the emotion of excitement with anxiety. So it's really important to focus on excitement. You should be really excited about performing with a little bit of anxiety, which is a good thing, right? Where anxiety becomes a bad thing is when it becomes disproportionate, and then your excitement isn't utilized to elevate your performance. So you always want that proportion to be greater for excitement than it is for anxiety.
What's more dangerous, too confident or too anxious?
But without question, too anxious. When you talk about the emotion of anxiety, one of the most typical forms of anxiety is that fight or flight response. So when that anxiety gets beyond a manageable range, well, then it starts to affect an athlete physiologically, where the brain flips a switch and it disproportionately produces adrenaline and endorphins, which sucks the life out of your muscle tissue to be able to perform at the level that it needs to succeed. So once you get too much adrenaline and endorphins and it sucks, all those cortisol levels get too high, there's a physiological component to it, and that's really dangerous.
What separates elite performers mentally in one word?
Without question, it's resiliency. To get to that elite level, athletes have to go through far more failures than their successes. So it's really important that athletes develop that characteristic and that trait of resiliency to continue to push through. When you get knocked down, get back up. When you get knocked down, get back up. So I would say resiliency to me is probably the most important characteristic.
So growth happens through failure.
Growth definitely comes through failure. Wisdom comes through success. So when you're successful, you gain wisdom, which is where that experience comes in of putting yourself in that position. Athletes have to keep working so hard to get themselves in that position. And once they're in that position and succeed, that's where that analog of wisdom really becomes part of that performance expectation.
And wisdom is just maybe a data collection in your mind of successes. Is how would you describe wisdom in this situation?
Well, wisdom is definitely gained through experience. So you want an athlete and you want to put your athletes into situations where they gain credible and valuable experience. Some forms of experience can overdo it. I get a little concerned about the select teams that are out there. And for example, baseball. I mean, some of these kids I work with in baseball, they're playing 60, 70, 80 games a summertime, which you got to be really careful about burnout. So you want your athletes to get experience, but you don't want them to get burned out and just kind of go through that performance fatigue that really doesn't benefit that stockpile of wisdom that you need.
And piggybacking off of my question, if failure is part of the process to gain wisdom, it's amazing how, as human beings, we let fear control us, knowing that failure could be a good thing.
Well, you want to be fearless. That's definitely how you want to perform. And you shouldn't be afraid to make a mistake because that's where the learning opportunity, the growth opportunity comes. So that's where it's really difficult depending on what type of sport the athlete is playing in. You really have to play fearlessly, which doesn't mean you play recklessly or stupid or anything like that. But when an athlete plays fearlessly, those are growth opportunities to become better and better. Whenever an athlete performs in fear and then they're not successful, well, then the residual emotion, the casualty emotion is guilt and shame and embarrassment and even greater fear. So you want an athlete that's fearless, but not in fear of making a mistake.
Those emotions play a really big part of that process. I'm going to go into that here with my next few questions. You use a sports psychology model built around thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors. Can you walk us through that model and how it shows up in real competition?
Absolutely. And this past weekend, this is the time of year I watch a lot of golf. And this past weekend, Wyndham Clark played out of his mind on Sunday. So if you can reference those types of athletic performance as I go through this model, that's a great example to apply these concepts. So when I work with an athlete, the most important domain is clearly their thought processes. Those thought processes, that internal talk, that internal chatter that our athletes have with regards to how they're performing or not performing. So I always ask athletes to talk to me a little bit about any negative thoughts you have. And surprisingly, every athlete that I work with, whether it's a high performing high school athlete, a collegiate athlete, or a professional athlete, they all have some degree of negative thinking. So it's really important in that domain to make sure you're conscious and you're aware of it. And this is a basic principle in psychology. If you're not aware of your negative thoughts, then you can't fix them. So it's really important that athletes look themselves in the mirror, take ownership of any negative thought they have. I typically ask them to journal them when they have the opportunity, because when you write things down, you're more likely to be conscious of them. And then the strategies that I use, they can fix that really quickly. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So I want them to be able to have ownership and be aware of those thought processes. That's the first domain and probably the most important. The second domain is their attitudes or beliefs about their performance. Those attitudes and beliefs are typically the result and the byproduct of external variables. When we go back to your thought processes, those are your internal thoughts. The external variables are things like coaches, the weather or conditions of the field. Social media is a huge external variable in today's athletes. It could be teammates. It could be the opponent. It could be academics. It could be a sports related injury or the athletic trainer or the strength and conditioning person. So those are all external variables that are going to influence in a positive or a negative way their attitudes or beliefs. Then the third domain is pretty simple. It's the behaviors. So whenever you watch athletes, there are subtle cues that you can tell when an athlete is in a bad mental state or not in a flow state. So those are things like their head is held down, their shoulders are slumping, they're distracted by an external variable, they're throwing things. I mean, those are pretty egregious behaviors there. But those behaviors are typically more subtle as the athletes get older and more experienced, and you just have to pay attention to those behavioral cues. Now, when you take all three of those domains, if all those are positive, if your thought processes are positive, if your attitudes and beliefs are positive, and your behavior is pretty positive, when they all overlap each other in that fashion, that's what we refer to as a flow state or a rhythm state. And most athletes that I work with, they can maintain a flow state a high probability, but we want them to be able to control and train themselves to get into a zone state. And the way that athletes do that is they, with intention, remember, this is an intentional process, they take positive emotions, put them into that flow state, and that's when you increase the probability of getting into a zone, which is that effortless Steph Curry step back three that you see him take so often when he's in that zone state.
Can you give an example, Dr. Ganshirt, of how someone would interject emotions into that model?
Yes. And actually, Jeff, we have research studies on elite athletes, professional athletes, collegiate athletes, and on down. When we do surveys and ask athletes to rank order emotions and prioritize them, which one is the most important emotion to put into that flow state? And universally, regardless of what sport, whether it's an individual or team sport, the universal, single, most important emotion to put into that flow state is confidence. You have to put confidence into that flow state. Once you insert that emotion, now your probability goes up. So when we go back to your thought processes and you have a negative thought, when you train yourself in that moment to utilize a confident thought or a confident statement, and you mentally rehearse that, well, now you're putting that emotion into that flow state and increasing your probability. So an example of that would be, I'm the dog out here. Nobody's going to beat me. So just a simple statement like that, and whatever works for that individual athlete, given their personality and kind of how they're comfortable with using certain statements, when they use that consistently, they're putting confidence in that flow state and they're increasing their probability.
And that emotion that they infuse, for instance, it could be, like you mentioned, confidence, or it could be that phrase, I'm the dog out here, that is built up over a time of execution of their skill and their role maybe within the team. And so it's a combination of a lot of factors that go into that final piece as well. Is that correct?
And it's all those factors that you have to be aware of, train yourself, and then be successful at. We talked a little bit earlier about being successful. Certainly, you're not going to be 100% successful, but that's where you're not as successful. And then you use opportunities to build on that. And a real practical example is free throws. We've got the NBA finals going on right now. So when you see some of these professional players step up to the free throw line, I mean, they go through their pre-shot routine. They've trained themselves that before they release that ball, I got this. This is going right in. Nothing but net. I mean, that's a real simple mantra that builds confidence over and over again. And that's where these NBA players have trained themselves throughout years and years and years to increase that free throw percentage just by simply embedding confidence in that opportunity.
Dr. Ganshirt, in one of our dialogues, I remember years ago when you talked about the confidence of successes. So it's success, success, success. You keep climbing the ladder. And Dr. Ganshirt, is that really sport specific, or can that confidence come from other areas of life and parlayed into that specific skill set?
I think success starts when you wake up in the morning. I really talk to athletes not just about what they're doing in the weight room or in practice or in meetings or in games and so forth. You have to be successful in every aspect of your life. For example, student athletes. I mean, you don't have to be a straight A student, but you have to be successful to whatever your ability is. You have to be successful in making your bed every morning and making sure your place is well kept. You have to take care of your personal hygiene. You have to take care of your diet. You have to take care of your spiritual growth. All those are opportunities to build successes, which they feed off of. An athlete feeds off of everything they're successful in their life to that performance on the field.
Dr. Ganshirt, I was reading about a top tennis player and how when he's in competition, he will read the body language of his opponent and take those cues to work in his advantage. And so in your model, that body language, is that something that has to start with the thoughts or with the beliefs and all those other things? Does it come down to the thought, or how does that work when, let's say, in competition you have your head down or you're cussing at yourself or just whatever it is? How does that get rectified for the athlete?
Well, part of it is the awareness. I mean, you have to be aware that the behavior is there. And one of the things that I think is very useful is to just obviously look at the tape and look at the video, because an athlete is really not self-aware because they're not looking at themselves. So when you look at film, particularly in the downtime of the play, for example, in the NFL, I mean, the average play is anywhere from 4 to 7 or 8 seconds, all right? But the time in between plays and the body language in between offensive and defensive series on the sidelines, you can watch these behaviors. You can watch golfers. I mean, you saw Rory McIlroy in the PGA. There was somebody in the Philadelphia area that yelled USA, and he got upset by that. He pointed him out, and guess what he did on the next shot? He executed fully. So it's just really important to be aware of those behaviors, and then get your shoulders back, get your head up. All right. You may show a flash of disappointment or discouragement, but you really have to be mindful of the body language, because opponents feed off of that, and they're going to take advantage of that as soon as they see that body language change. But if they see the resiliency and the confidence and the determination of not allowing that body language to project failure or in fear performance, then you're going to have an athlete that's going to pop back up, and the opponent's not going to feed off of it.
So that self-awareness, does it always go back to the number one thing you mentioned, the thoughts?
Partially, yeah. But then the other part of it is, again, you just have to learn and look at the film. And again, these are very subtle body language that these professional athletes will show. And most of the athletes are fairly stoic, but that doesn't mean that inside their thoughts aren't negative, or they may have a different belief or an attitude that's affecting them at that moment. But they're just not showing it. They're very careful about their body language and so forth when they're not successful.
With emotions, Dr. Ganshirt, can you talk a little bit about emotional targeting, emotions maybe for some of the various sports, and even how coaches can use that to their advantage to help the athlete?
Where the goal is, as far as a sports psychologist, is being able to get to know the athlete, and you have to mine the characteristics and the personality of that particular athlete. So remember, I referenced earlier the priority of emotions. Confident is number one. But if your personality is different, for example, a linebacker in the NFL, we want him to be confident, but we also want him to be fearless, determined, and resilient. We want him to use a little bit of anger. So there are specific thoughts that you can utilize to put confidence, determination, aggressiveness, resiliency into that. So each one of those statements is specific to the emotion you want to target. All right. Now, a place kicker, we want our place kicker to be confident, but we don't want our place kicker to be aggressive. I mean, you don't want him being aggressive towards the ball when he's kicking a field goal. We want him to be calm and relaxed and confident and so forth. So there's different emotions for different positions, for different personalities. For example, some athletes are comfortable using curse words, and some are not. So all these are very simple variables that you have to factor in to whatever is athlete sports specific to targeting what emotion, and then train yourself in whatever situation demands that emotion.
So, does an athlete walk into competition in a natural state with these emotions, or is it something that just is a byproduct of just their evolution as an athlete and as a human being?
Yeah, it's just part of their evolution. And where you hear athletes talk is putting themselves in positions. So once you're in that position, that's where the growth opportunity is to succeed, gain wisdom, and apply these concepts. You can't apply these concepts if you never get to the Super Bowl. You can never apply these concepts if it's never fourth and goal and you have to score a winning touchdown. So athletes have to put themselves in the position, have the self awareness of the concepts and strategies to apply, and then succeed at it. So, and that's what's so exceptional about these elite athletes is that you have to put yourself in those positions to win. And the only way you train yourself is to get yourself in that position.
So, Dr. Ganshirt, we originally talked about the flow state, which is when the thoughts, the attitudes and beliefs, and the behaviors are all in the positive. And then we talked about adding emotion to give you that last 10% of performance. And so, Dr. Ganshirt, for those listening, how would you describe the flow state, and how would you define or describe the zone, which really kind of happens rarely in sports?
Yeah, you have to get yourself into a higher probability of a flow state or a rhythm. All right. So that's the baseline. And where athletes get better and better is increasing the probability of staying in that flow state consistently throughout whatever opportunity or game or situation it is. So you want that baseline to get higher and higher and higher to maintain that flow state. And when you have to flip that switch for that 10 to 15% of opportunities to go beyond a flow state, that's where you want to insert that emotion and increase that probability of outperforming your previous level of experience. And that's what zone performance is just getting better and better and better and greater and greater and greater at these opportunities to succeed.
Dr. Ganshirt, it sounds easier than it is because I know, and we talked about this and you mentioned to me as human beings, it's really hard to stay focused. You were telling me in, let's say, an NFL football game that lasts maybe 3 hours, your mind can drift and wander. And so sometimes I remember we talked about a player who had trouble stringing consistent performances together. But there's times maybe, even when we're talking about the highest competitors in the world, where you kind of revert to maybe your life off the field and what you're going through and how that can affect not only your flow state, but even if you're in a flow state, the emotion that you bring to the competition. Can you speak to that a little bit about just that keeping focus and our life outside of the sport?
Yeah, it's really, really a critical factor. When we talk about psychological wellness in general, that obviously involves things outside the sidelines of competition. So you've got to have your personal life in order. You've got to have your family life in order. You've got to have your relationships in order. You got to have your spiritual life in order. All those things have to be taken care of on the side because if they're not, they're going to be a distraction during the game. And there are plenty of opportunities in football. There's opportunities between each play to reset things. In golf, in between each shot, you have the opportunity to reset things. Sports like basketball and soccer, those are very fluid sports. So it's really hard, unless there's a timeout or a dead ball, to apply these concepts and make them work. But it's just really important to take every opportunity you can to keep yourself dialed in and in that zone performance. And then at the same time, take care of business on the field and make sure that there's good boundaries and those distractions don't suck away from that performance on the field.
Dr. Ganshirt, you talked about, to help you get into the zone, a mental loop of performance, and that consists of recognizing, regrouping, and refocusing. Can you walk us through that process?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's where the opportunity is just very simple. And again, this is one of the misconceptions about sports performance is this is a simple process. You don't have to make it overcomplicated. So that three-step process that I use with recognizing things, that goes to what we referenced earlier to being conscious and aware of it. So as soon as you're aware of it, then you can fix it. The regrouping statement, for example, is also the next step. So when we go back to cognition, the thought process, recognizing that negative thought, I suck, or what if I fail, or what if the coach takes me out? That's the recognizing part. You have to have a regrouping statement, a thought process. So a simple regrouping statement to get you off the negative thought would be, let's go, get it together, next play, next rep. I mean, that's the regrouping statement to get you off the negative. And then the refocusing is that zone, that confident statement. I'm the dog. Nobody's going to meet me. I'm the goat. So that's an example of recognizing, regrouping, and refocusing to target that emotion to get into that zone performance.
And you mentioned some sports are fast paced between plays. So this is going to happen in a very short time. Or will this even happen maybe when there's a timeout if the sport is heavily fast paced like basketball?
Yeah. So when I work with basketball players, there's obviously a change of possession. So you can use markers on the court on where you apply certain concepts. So what I typically ask players, and it's a training process, is that once you reach the half court line, that's when you have already had trained yourself to refocus from the rebound to the outlet pass to offense to get yourself refocused and in that zone performance when you cross the half court line. Now, when there's a dead ball or a timeout, you can definitely use those concepts. But in the transition sports that I work with, those are the cues that they have to use on the court or on the soccer field to use those concepts to get themselves into that state.
Yeah, I remember me and you talked about the jumbotrons in the National Football League. Like there's a 30-second or 35-second gap between plays, and players are looking at their highlights. And actually, you pointed out that's probably maybe not the best thing for them to because they should be going through that process. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. You're going to see that play on the sidelines or on Monday or Wednesday in practice. You're going to see it probably 15 times as far as what you could have done better at. But yeah, that's a really good example of an external variable, not using that time resourcefully to get yourself ready for that next opportunity to outperform your previous play.
And Dr. Ganshirt, I just want to speak to the coaches for 1 second. You mentioned in our conversation about emotional targeting and how a coach needs to know the athlete at a personal level. But I just want to re-emphasize the role of a coach in this process.
It's vital because again, athletes are focusing on executing the performance physically and mentally, the play. But when I watch practices and listen to the coaches coach guys up, we always hear that term, coach them up, coach them up. A coach may give the athlete advice on how to do better with that physical rep, but the great coaches are the ones that provide an affirmation at the end of the coaching aspect of it. So when you work with a wide receiver to run a route differently or better, you're going to instruct them how to do that. But then shortly after that, great job, man. Great execution. So that's where a coach is vital to stockpiling that confidence because they then executed the coaching that is necessary to get them better and better after each rep in practice. And this applies to strength and conditioning in the weight room for what you guys do. Every rep that a player has in the weight room is an opportunity to use these concepts. So you can get into a flow state in between stations in the weight room. But once you sit down on that bench and you grab that bar, your thought should be, I'm going to crush this rep. And then you do that 10 times or whatever. So that's a really simple training technique to get into that zone state. Now, that doesn't mean you do those 10 reps and you're just growling around the weight room and so forth. But each rep in the weight room, each rep in practice are opportunities to train yourself so that during game time, it's second nature. You don't have to think about this stuff anymore.
Dr. Ganshirt, can you just repeat one more time? I thought what you said was gold. At the end of a coaching cue or technique, how should you finish that instruction?
There has to be a positive affirmation because more often than not, when you instruct an athlete to do something better, subconsciously they're thinking, well, I didn't do that very well. The coach must be mad at me, or maybe I'm going to be replaced by my backup guy and so forth. And that's not what coaching is about. Coaches are not about making you feel bad, it's about making you better. So athletes are naturally going to be self critical because they're somewhat of a perfectionist. You don't want that to deter from the coaching aspect of it. And sometimes athletes aren't good at it. So coaches should always end that when appropriate. Obviously, if they don't succeed, you don't go, well, that a boy. But when they succeed, it's like, yo, great job. You crushed that rep. Now do it again. So now it's really important to give that affirmation so that they can get ready for that next rep to use these mental strategies to get better and better.
Yeah, I think NFL players, at the end of the day, from the coaches, they also just want good information to help them succeed. And sometimes as coaches, we have a tendency to throw out what's called garbage statements, meaning that I remember in an NFL game where a player was coming off the field and the coach was yelling at him, get off the block, get off the block. And that was the obvious reaction when really the player could have just used good information to help them be successful.
Yes, no, I agree. And the thing you don't want from a coaching perspective is the athlete to take it personal. All right.
Mm.
This is not a personal relationship or dynamic. Not that we don't have a personal relationship with our players. Having said that, it's very important. What could you have done better and move on as opposed to make them feel ashamed or embarrassed or regret or whatever the negative emotion is. So, absolutely, this has to be informational, instructional, and then the opportunity to get better is obviously ahead of that player.
Dr. Ganshirt, you're 100% on point because as I think about while you were speaking, I can just see when a coach gives those garbage statements out of emotion, the player then escalates his emotion. And we're talking about the role of emotion getting in zone performance. And that player, it's going to be have a hard time getting into zone performance with that reaction sometimes from a coach.
Well, not just that, Jeff, the problem you have with a negative emotion, proportionate to how intense you process or feel that emotion, what do you think our probability of listening and then applying it is? It's not going to be very high. The more angry we get, the less likely we are to listen, and therefore we miss an opportunity for that athlete to get better. So it's all about positive communication, which is very different from instructional or teaching moments, which is what coaching is. You guys are teachers. We're all teachers.
Yeah, Dr. Gancher. And just to finish this topic up, sometimes we see those coaches who can be abusive in their words or actions to players. And maybe that's what we see on TV or whatever. But I think those great coaches in the background, as you mentioned earlier about relationships, they come full circle with that athlete and make them feel valued and loved in their own way. And that's kind of what maybe you don't see in front of the cameras.
Yeah, I mean, athletes today, they want tough coaching, but they don't want abusive coaching. There's a difference between the two. So as long as that comes from a reference point of making me better or I'm going to become a better player, well, then that's the growth opportunity because once it becomes abusive, that's when athletes kind of tune out. They don't listen anymore and they just stop listening.
Dr. Ganshirt, your expertise is in sports psychology, but I do want to talk about physical performance for 1 second. How much does physical discipline impact mental performance in your experience?
Well, it's so fascinating that athletes spend a disproportionate amount of time training for the competition that they're in. You take football. I mean, these players, these NFL players, are in meetings and practice an extensive period of time for a 3-hour game on Sundays. Golfers, they will hit thousands of golf balls just to get that one opportunity to make birdie on the 18th hole to win the tournament. So it's just so important to take those opportunities in practice to use these concepts, train yourself, and even in the weight room. I can't speak highly enough of opportunities in the weight room, particularly now where athletes, the NFL, we're in OTAs right now, where every rep is an opportunity to grow from. And these are opportunities that I think are all too often missed, where practice and the routine of workout is not taken advantage of.
Dr. Ganshirt, staying on that physical a little bit and emotion. I remember in the NFL when we would, in the off season, have a 2 hour workout, an hour running, an hour lifting. It was very intensive. In the morning, the day ended at lunchtime. And after lunchtime, players would come back and get some extra work in the weight room. And I remember a dialogue with you and talking about how there's that emotion that players get, that emotional positive hit by doing some of these extra things that they maybe don't need to, but in their life, they maybe are not getting them elsewhere. So they go back in and get more of that maybe in the physical or other areas. Can you speak to that for a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, that's their identity. These
Mhm.
professional athletes, they put so much time and effort beginning as a child, all through Pee Wee football and high school and so forth. They put so much time into their identity, and that's where they get their mental wellness from. So if they didn't have a particularly good workout, right, where they can rebuild their confidence and feeling of success and accomplishment and satisfaction, is go back and do more of it, which is where they can be successful at. And then the other part, which has radically changed over the past several years, Jeff, is how are these athletes recovering and doing what they need to get their body physically and mentally ready to go into the next day of competing again. So that's been a significant improvement over the past years when we are looking at the draft process at the collegiate level. What did you learn with recovery methods, which involves cold tubs, stretching, yoga, meditation, strength bands, cryo chambers, hyperbolic chambers, float tanks? I mean, what are you doing to get yourself ready for the next opportunity to perform? And that's where athletes can also gain confidence and feel good about their body physically and mentally to get themselves ready to go the next day.
Dr. Ganshirt, talking about relational performance. What does a bad teammate look like psychology wise?
This is a fairly transparent question that you just asked. These athletes who are not, quote, good teammates, though, that goes back to body language, and they're very disconnected. They're aloof. They're unwilling to accept feedback. I know in my personal and professional life, whenever someone criticizes me, well, it may not be 100% true, but that doesn't mean a partial truth of what feedback I'm getting can't make me a better person or a better clinician. So, a teammate that's not willing to listen and take some feedback to get better is definitely a teammate that's probably not going to gel well. And then you look at kind of the locker room. I mean, those informal relationships. One of the team building concepts in the Bengals locker room is the ping pong table, for example. There's so many things that happen around a simple ping pong game that you can get some eyes into good teammates versus bad teammates. And then the other thing is these guys are very slow to change. They're very reticent or very reluctant to make changes to become better and better and better. So that's one variable. And then the last one is you got to have common characteristics. You got to be competitive at ping pong, just as competitive as you are on the field or in the weight room. So you have to have like characteristics. That everybody doesn't have to be the same, but you have to have enough characteristics to emotionally connect with each other, which is where the team building aspect of football. That's the beauty of football is the team building aspect. The offensive linemen, it's like a symphony. They have to work in unison with each other. And that's where all the team building aspects come into play in the NFL.
When talking about spiritual performance, you've shared that you receive a scripture on your phone each morning through social media, and it helps guide your mindset for the day. How does starting your day with that kind of spiritual grounding impact maybe your focus, your perspective, and your performance?
The most important thing for me in spirituality is the fact that that's the single area that I can get emotions of faith and hope from. And when you look at our society and when you look at sports performance in general, but our society, things are very negative out in our society, not only politically, but social wise and so forth. So those are that area, our spirituality is the primary area that I can get faith and hope from. So when I pray or when I reflect or when I look at the thought for the day, as far as these scriptures that I get sent to me, that keeps me grounded because there's so much negativity that we all have to deal with in society. And particularly as a psychologist in my clinical practice, all my patients are dealing with negativity. So I'm not a Christian counselor, but spirituality is very important. It's a component of therapy in general to make sure you feel a sense of faith and hope in a world that sucks the life out of us sometimes. So it's a really important thing for me to start my day and to end my day with faith and hope and gratitude with the blessing that God has given me to do this every day and make a difference in this world.
And I think you mentioned there's an effect on your brain physiologically that a prayer or reading scripture has on the brain.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. This is where the athletes and in a heightened state of performance, you're getting that adrenaline being pumped for hours. A game, not just the game itself, but game day itself is very emotionally draining because there's so much emotional intensity. So it's really important to be able to find ways to get calmness and relaxation, gratitude and faith and hope. And the way that you do that is through reflection and prayer and meditation. And those are the emotions that you have to get back into your wellness from a mental health standpoint.
Dr. Ganshirt, what's one moment or decision that changed your life?
Oh, this is an easy one, Jeff. When I was going through my undergrad at University of Kentucky, it's the typical college experience. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? So when I started at University of Kentucky, my major was actuarial science, and that's a field of study that's all statistics and predicting how many red cars get into accidents. And after a year of that, I was miserable, absolutely miserable, because it didn't fulfill me. I volunteered one day to spend time at the Eastern State Hospital, which is a state institution. And the volunteer was just go talk to patients on the unit because they don't have anybody to talk to other than other mentally ill patients or staff. So the one person that basically guided my purpose in life was an individual who attempted suicide at a gas station. He took a gas pump, poured gasoline over his head, and lit himself on fire. And he didn't have any earlobes, or he had two holes for his nose. He didn't have any fingers. I mean, he was literally burnt alive, but he survived that. That was the most tragic and fascinating person to talk to. And from there on, I've been in psychology and wanted to help people the rest of my life.
Dr. Ganshirt, when I was with the Bengals, myself and Chip Morton, who was the head strength coach, we would sit into or in interviews with some of the prospects that the Cincinnati Bengals were interviewing at the combine. And I remember in a meeting that lasted 15 minutes, that was the time frame that each team could have with a player, the first person to speak in that room with ownership, management, all the coaches, player personnel, you were the first person to speak. And could you just give a little insight, putting you on the spot a little bit, maybe a sample question that you would ask a prospective player and what you were trying to gain from some of those questions?
So back when we started doing the kind of the speed dating, the 15-minute interviews at the combine, one intention was to get that player off center a little bit because in preparation for the combine and draft, players go through mock interviews and their agents and they're trained to go through these interviews. So one function of the questions that I asked was kind of get them off center and make them feel a little bit uncomfortable. So I would ask questions like, who was president of the United States during the Civil War? Repeat these series of numbers. In what way are an apple and orange alike? So these are all questions that just kind of like, these aren't football related questions. Why am I answering these questions? So it gave us a feel about how they were thinking on their feet a little bit. It got them off of their rhythm, that they had their script in their mind that they were going to talk about and role play through all these situations. So one objective of that was just to kind of get them off center a little bit, to make them nervous to see how they would respond during the interview.
And as a sports psychologist, when that happened, how did you grade that or how did you note that? What did that look like after the interview and your communication to the scouts or management?
It basically goes back to how were they able to kind of follow through with the football? Because that was typically I was allotted maybe 5 to 6 to 7 minutes. And then they went into kind of looking at film on offense or defense. So they had to make that transition. They had to turn their chair, look at the film, and get their football mind back on. So these are all subtle behaviors, subtle insights into what makes this athlete a potential draft pick for us. How is he going to fit into our culture? What are his leadership abilities? How has he handled resiliency? What is his support system like? Are there any at risk behaviors we need to be concerned about? So, all those things, we're just trying to get a simple read really quickly. And then obviously, we can follow up with them through the draft process and when they come to the stadium for other interviews.
I'd like to close our time, Dr. Ganshirt, with a few quick hitters. One habit every athlete needs.
To develop an intentional mindset, get out of bed with some intention and make it a conscious thing. Don't make it a kind of a mindless thing that you're kind of walking through your routine. Let's be intentional with everything we do throughout the day as best we can.
So when someone gets out of the bed, what would you suggest their thought process be?
It can be something simple. I got to get dressed, take a shower, brush my teeth, and I got to get going here. So that's the groundwork, intentional mindset that sets the stage for the rest of the day.
One mindset shift that changes everything.
This goes back to spirituality. I believe that our footprints are laid out for us. God has our plan for us, and you just got to plant that next step in that footprint. That's all. What's the next step?
What ruins more careers than anything else?
Money. Without question, money. I'm blessed to do this. I do this because it serves a purpose and I enjoy what I'm doing. The old cliche, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. That's true. So money is really, really a difficult negative thing sometimes.
And I can speak on that. I know in the National Football League, finances do affect players because many players, they financed their family plus relatives. And one of the players that we had or that I worked with was a high draft pick. And in the weight room, he was a little despondent. You could tell his mind was wandering. And when we struck up a dialogue, this guy had a great heart, but he's like, Coach, I have to really provide for like almost 20 people in his family and friends. And it really weighed on him. And I think that affects performance, the money.
Absolutely. And most people don't realize, but the average career in the NFL is only 2.5, 3 years. So it's extremely difficult to get to that level and to stay there and then get that next contract. But when you look at athletes that get that transgenerational contract, these are the guys that truly love football and put the work in.
One thing people should stop doing immediately.
Jeff, these are layup questions for me. Social media, without question. Social media today is so detrimental to sports performance and mental health. There's a great book out called The Anxious Generation, talks about too much screen times. And I've got 6 grandkids right now. So these grandkids cannot be raised on social media or these devices because it's so detrimental to everything.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
Be patient. Life is a marathon. It's not a sprint. Got to take a lot of deep breaths throughout lifetime, but just be patient. Everything works out. You just got to keep working at it and keep working at it. And patience is a virtue. That's so true.
Yeah, from a spirituality or faith perspective, God is patient with us. So to me, that patience should be extended to others and even myself.
Couldn't agree with you more.
If someone feels stuck, Dr. Ganshirt, right now, where should they start?
Well, they definitely have to start with the person they trust the most. This goes back to the social media thing. Social media in our society has created a lot of isolation and loneliness and just kind of fear. So if that person's feeling that, go to the person you trust the most, get some advice. It might be a mentor. It might be a coach, it might be a pastor or a spiritual leader. Obviously, it could be a family member or your spouse, but it's really important to go to that person that you trust and who knows you the most.
That's going to wrap up today's episode of the Built for Winning podcast. A huge thank you to Dr. Peter Ganshirt for taking the time to share his story and his perspective. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the episode. Iron sharpens iron. We'll catch you the next time on the Built for Winning podcast.